Hi, I'm Dixon Gould, Chair of the Manitoba Protein Consortium. I'm also President of the Progressive Group of Companies in Niverville, Manitoba. We are involved in primary production with swine production, poultry production, and beef production, as well as a grain operation. We're also involved in further processing within Winkler Meats and the Pioneer Meats. I'm very excited to be here today to introduce Dr. Sylvain Charlebois and as our featured speaker today, as we're going into the transformation of the protein sector today. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sylvain. Is a professor in food distribution and policies in the facilities of management and agriculture at Dalhousie University in Halifax. He's also the Senior Director of Agri-Food Analytic Lab, also located in the Dalhousie University. He is also, as well, the former Dean of the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. And before joining Dalhousie, he was affiliated with the University of Guelph Aral Food Institute, which he co-founded. While at the University of Guelph, he was also the Associate Dean of Research for the College of Business and Economics. He's well known as the food processor or the food professor. In my world, it's processor. In his world, it's professor. His current research interest lies in a broad array of food distribution, security, and safety. He is one of the world's most cited scholars in food supply chain management, food value chains, and traceability. He has authored 5 books on global food systems. His most recent one published in 2017 by Wiley Blackwell, entitled Food Safety, Risk Intelligence, and Benchmarking. He has also published over 500 peer-reviewed journal articles in several academic publications. Furthermore, his research is featured in several newspapers and media, very large, all of the major ones, the Lancet, the Economist, New York Times, Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, National Post, Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, and all the major news networks across Canada, US, and including Europe and BC, or BBC, and beyond. I just really want to welcome Sylvain to today's session. Thanks, Sylvain, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Dixon. It's a pleasure to be back, even though it's virtual. I was actually at your protein summit a few years ago before hell broke loose back in in the winter of 2019 or 2020 rather. No, it was actually in 2019, I believe. It was a great session when the protein summit happened to launch the strategy. I was a big fan of the strategy. I still am. And I had the pleasure to meet with the group last week again to get an update on what's been happening. And I must say, I've been impressed with everything that's been accomplished so far with the protein strategy. And I do travel quite a bit. And I do talk a lot about proteins and market trends. And I often actually mention the Manitoba strategy as a good example of how we should be doing things. So I guess today what I'll do with the time I have, I'll talk briefly about some of the things that I believe that Manitoba is doing well, and then I'll dive into what I call I'll describe what I call the protein revolution, part 3. Question mark. That's the title of my talk today. So I'll talk briefly about what we're seeing from a macroeconomic perspective. Then we'll look at consumer behavior, and then we'll start talking about another menace on the horizon. Well, menace, another phenomena happening, I guess, in the protein world that I think we need to keep in mind. And then I'll finish off going back to the Manitoba strategy. I'll talk again about things that perhaps the group should be thinking about moving forward. So lots of exciting stuff for you today. So I will be sharing my screen. If you've seen me talk before, I'm not a big fan of using PowerPoint. So hopefully you can see what I see. Let me see. It's okay. So hopefully it's working well. So yeah, so the protein strategy in Manitoba is, I think, so far a success story. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, but I actually have seen um, what has happened in the province, and frankly, some of the things that have happened were quite significant. More investment into the region, more processing in the region as well. But not only Manitoba, across the prairies as well. Basically the strategy, I think, has helped make protein a very, very topical issue, an important issue for the economy in the province, which is really wonderful. It's wonderful to see. I don't live in the province, but I can feel that something's happening. I mean, you've seen a massive amount of investments coming from outside, which is really what you want with 1 million people, and because you're seeing companies from outside looking in and say, this is an economy I can trust. This is an economy I can invest in, and you got the right people, the right resources, the right space, the right knowledge, and those are indicators that you really want to look at to kind of reassure that you're on the right path. And I think you guys are on the right path, but there are challenges, and I'll get to that a little bit later. I took this sentence from your deck, summarizing what you guys have been up to over the last few years, and I actually do really like the sentence, and the reason why I really like that sentence is because of one word, choice, and frankly, I think that's embedded in the spirit of the strategy, is really to provide choice on the supply side, and of course on the demand side as well. It wasn't about excluding anything, it was about including everybody, which is really unique. It's a unique approach in the country. I'm not sure if you guys realize it, but it is unique. It's not just about looking at what I call the vegetable protein industry. I was never really comfortable with the term plant-based, but I actually do think there's a bright future for vegetable proteins as well as with animal proteins, and the strategy really just captures the strengths of all these components together, growing the economy together, not excluding everyone. And at the end of the day, it's really all about the consumer looking for different things, different choice, essentially, which is why I really, really like this particular phrase that you have in your deck, because it's really telling of the philosophy you guys have fostered through over the last few years, and it has paid off, which is great. So let's talk about what we've gone through right now. I think it's we can't avoid talking about COVID. We have to. We've been in this for almost 2 years now. The reason why we're virtual, it's because of the pandemic. Unfortunately, the pandemic, I think, is going to be it's going to leave a legacy, obviously, on consumers, with the industry as well. I don't think things are going to go back to how things were, simply because, and I don't, if you have children, you probably know that. I mean, the way that risks have been managed the last couple of years has been transformational, and disruptive, really, for a lot of people. Most importantly for children, and it's going to stay with them for a very long time. And so the way they see risk, the way they live, will also be impacted by COVID. The post-COVID market is going to be tricky. All been talking about supply chains. Frankly, I've studied supply chains for 25 years, and I've never talked about supply chains as much as now, which is actually a good sign. I mean, people, are starting to realize that food just doesn't appear on store shelves at the grocery store. They know that something's more sophisticated does happen before food shows up at the grocery store, which is a good thing, but supply chains will remain mysterious. People are more food literate, they know more about food, but there's still many question marks as far as supply chain goes. And if you're in business, you know what I'm talking about. Things will be slow for a while, probably for the next 9 months, as we exit this pandemic, just because the world economy is just not in sync as it used to. There are a lot of bottlenecks here and there, and we're gonna have to really navigate around that. What's beautiful about the food industry is that it does do well with bottlenecks. It's always able to deliver and execute no matter what happens with supply chains. But it's been difficult, and expectations will have to be managed appropriately. The economy, I'm confident that the economy will do well. However, there is a problem called inflation. You may have noticed, and inflation is becoming a problem. Obviously, I'm in the U.S. Right now, working with some friends at the University of South Florida, and it's a huge problem here. It's a problem in Canada. It's a problem in the Western world, and we do believe that inflation will become a factor, especially when it comes to food. So today I'll be talking a lot about price points, just basically tell you that this is going to be an issue. It's going to drive behavior. It's going to drive decisions also by companies, just because right now things are very, very tight, and consumers are becoming more and more frugal. What I mean by that, consumers may actually trade sideways, may trade down. A lot of things will happen, and they may actually go to different sources to get their food as well. They'll actually be gathering data differently as well. So lots going on when it comes to the consumer and the market. The job market, I think, is going to remain solid for a while. Interest rates are likely to rise, which is going to create a perfect storm for everyone. So shelter costs, food costs, heating costs, we're seeing with oil right now. So there's a bit of a perfect storm that I think the food industry needs to keep in mind in terms of what where people are in their minds when it comes to finances. So over the last 2 years, I think really the market was inflated. There's been an influx of public capital and people saving a lot. And so there was, I think, a lot of people, not everyone, of course, but a lot of people felt that they had access to more money, which is great. But I think we are expecting things to shift in 2022 and 2023. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we're seeing with the macro environment so far. Whether it's in Canada or the Western world, basically this is a global phenomena, and of course when it comes to proteins, it's a global market. So you want to keep that in mind as much as possible. The protein landscape in particular is really interesting as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, the biggest, of course, it's something I didn't talk about the last time I was with you guys because it wasn't really an issue. But because of the pandemic, the work from home thing is going to, I think, be quite a priority for us to think about. What kind of marketplace are we going to be looking at? And as soon as you spend more time at home, you do become a different food consumer. Think of food service. Think of the gardening phenomena. 17% of Canadians actually garden now, and they weren't before the pandemic. In food service, the split was 65-35 before the pandemic. So Canadians spend 65% of their food budget on in retail, 35% in service. That went down to 991 in March of 2020, April. 9% service, 91% retail. Now we're up to about, I'd say, 72-28 approximately, okay, across the country. I don't think we're going to get back to 35 anytime soon. I think the service industry is going to be struggling for a while, and frankly, menu prices are going to go way up. You're already seeing it because their costs are going up, labor is going up. And I'm just thinking some provinces, they've seen their minimum wage increase by 25% in food service. Ontario is actually a good example of that. So you can see that really there are many headwinds for the food service industry, and I actually don't think that it's going to attract more people. For at the beginning, of course, when lockdowns are over and people are out, yes, but after a while, when reality sets in financially, people will be more careful. So it's a bit unfortunate for protein because uh, vegetable proteins have actually done very well in service, and service has allowed this opening in retail. Really, that's kind of what happened with the A&W and Beyond Burger. So service actually is a huge factor when it comes to innovation these days, unlike say 30 years ago. Service influences retail a lot more than it used to. And so, but I do think it's going to come back. So overall, that's what I'm seeing in terms of sectors in general. Now, let's talk about the meat trifecta. Lots of interesting stuff happening there. So beef, chicken, and pork, all very popular around the world. Beef is struggling. All of three components of the trifecta actually got more expensive in Canada, in the US as well. So there's some concerns there. But I do think that meat counter economics will actually push consumers to go elsewhere in vegetable protein, seafood, fish, uh, and in dairy, it's going to be the same thing. Dairy products are increasing. If you've been to the grocery store since February 1st, you would have noticed that some of your dairy products have gone up by 8 to 15% already, because it's costing more to produce dairy products in Canada. So that's the challenge right now for the protein consumer. And I'm not suggesting that people are going to be walking away from animal proteins, but they'll be very careful. And vegetable proteins are going to become perhaps a really attractive and financially reasonable option, I guess. So it's bad news for animal proteins, but at the same time, I mean, it is what it is. To produce in livestock is costing more money. That's really, and you have to charge accordingly. And so there's a bit of a different scenario, I guess, when it comes to that. So that's kind of the protein landscape that we're looking. The other thing that I need to mention is the food guide. I mean, the food guide is now 3 years old. It's being institutionalized as we speak, and probably a lot of people listening in right now are saying it's the food guide. Nobody cares. Actually, people care in schools. In schools, if you remember the 4 food groups when you went to school, it stuck with you for a very long time. Even though you didn't follow the 4 groups, you kind of had it in mind. The narrative related to the new food guide really undermines animal proteins. Really, I mean, the drink of choice is water, not milk. There's not dairy. There's not a dairy or meat group. We're talking about proportions with proteins, and the guide actually encourages the consumption of vegetable protein as well. And so the guide is only 3 years old. But as the guide changes, and we're seeing it everywhere around the world, in China, in the US, it's the same thing. You're seeing really agencies encouraging people to, diversify their protein portfolio, if you will. So it's really interesting to watch, and the shift is actually going to be ongoing for quite some time, for many years. But here's one thing I want to talk to you about, and this goes back to the title of this talk, which is the Protein Revolution Part 3. So Part 1 was stabilizing systems after the Second World War. We came in with supply management. We made sure that Canadians had access to animal proteins. That was kind of the revolution, to make sure that we were sovereign, that we actually had food autonomy as a country. And it's the same in the US, same in Europe, with different policies. The focus was really about making sure we had food, strong protein. The second revolution was about vegetable protein, which started about a decade ago. And so we're really in the middle of it right now. But the third part of the protein revolution is right here. I have the pleasure to actually not sponsor, but advise startup companies out of the Creative Destruction Lab, Rockies, at the University of Calgary, and I do support different startups here and there. And I got to tell you, I mean, the money being poured into cellular agriculture or cultivated proteins is unbelievable. And I have to talk to you about this right now because the amount of money is just astounding. So this is up to 2020. I couldn't get any data for 2021, but here's what's going on around the world right now. This is the world. So you see that plant-based is still dominating the investment sort of portfolio when it comes to novel proteins. Second is fermented for dairy, and third is for cultivated. But really, you can see that there is momentum around this new alternative. And I actually do think that this could be an issue. China just a few weeks ago had decided to actually include cultivated meats into their strategy over the next 5 years, looking into it, investing into it. Singapore last year has granted permission to companies to commercialize cultivated chicken, lab grown chicken. So it's happening because Singapore has a policy of producing uh, uh, its policy is basically that 30% of all the meat consumed in Singapore, a city state, to be produced in Singapore with no space, no farms. So who could act as farms? Labs. So you're going to see a lot of that. Of course, in Canada, it's hard to imagine, especially in Manitoba, when space is not an issue. But where space is an issue, and in some areas in the United States, it is. In some areas in Europe, it is. It's in Asia as well. People are going to be looking into this, and all of that money is basically non-ag money. Most of it is non-ag money, and this is really what plant-based or vegetable proteins have done to agriculture, creating this portal for non-ag venture capitalists to actually pour money into ag, which is wonderful. It's great. It actually brings more innovation. It brings different set of eyes, different ways of seeing agriculture. It's the only way to innovate. And I actually do believe that some of the success that Manitoba has had in the last few years is a result of this new portal allowing different ways of looking at things. But it's not over. This is just the beginning. Like I said, part 3 is happening already right now. And we kind of have to be ready for it. Here's another graph that I wanted to show you from 2010 to 2020. Look at all the investments once again in terms of initiatives. I believe we're over 200 now in 2022. Lots of money being invested. So you got the categories: plant-based, fermentation, and cultivated. You can see that really there's a lot of attention given to other things than plant-based. Plant-based is still dominating, but I don't think it's going to dominate for a long, because once the infrastructure is built, and a lot of it is being built in Manitoba, people will actually look at other options. Here's another graph that I'd like to show you. So you may ask, okay, what's the cost? I mean, in terms of how will these products remain competitive? And when I say competitive, I mean cost, taste, texture, and especially, I mean, texture is a big deal. Okay, and you guys know that. So you can see right now, parity will be achieved terms of cost by before the end of next year, essentially. That's what we're expecting. And it probably could happen even before because of all the investments happening. When it comes to microorganism based agriculture, it could actually happen before 2025. Basically, making proteins with microbes. Essentially, it's a new technology that is being developed as we speak. And of course, animal cell base by 2020, 2031, 2032. We should achieve parity as well. So you can see that things are moving very quickly, which means that when you think about the Manitoba protein strategy, this is a unifying vision for what I would call traditional agriculture. And I know that at many people have actually said that well, plant-based products are fake meat. Well, there's nothing fake about lentils. It's food, and I've always been I've puzzled by that expression. It just meant that people weren't necessarily receptive to new sources of protein. But I actually think that that this is the legacy of Beyond Meat, I'm afraid. So on the one side, I think we need to celebrate what Beyond Meat has done, which is really demonstrate to the whole world that scaling up vegetable protein processing is actually possible. They are actually paying now for what I believe to be an overpowering narrative of comparing their products with another product people know very well and love, which is beef, right? And pork and chicken. I mean, Beyond Meat led the market to believe that it was there to replace something. And I have always thought it was the wrong strategy. And I think they're paying for it. And that's why their stock price is way down from its IPO a few years ago. But it's no indication to what is actually happening with vegetable proteins. I actually think that the vegetable protein market is growing. The pace is actually double of what we're seeing in the industry right now. So we're looking at healthy sales, and I'm not going to start talking to you about retail sales in Canada because you probably know all the numbers right now. They're pretty encouraging, and so you can see that really consumers aren't necessarily giving up on traditional meats, but they're certainly looking around and they're trying stuff and they're looking for some variety, which is really how you build an economy. This is how you actually bring more innovation. So it's actually quite interesting to see how things are evolving. So let's talk about the strategy itself over the last 3 years. And so I had the chance to meet with some of the team last week. I was briefed on it, looked at some decks. Amazing. I was very impressed. Well, for a couple of reasons. One, you had measurable goals, which is not always a given. Two, you basically are delivering in terms of jobs, in terms of economic growth, in terms of investments. You got some clear metrics there, and that's what you want for the strategy, and it's all evidently there. Third, you got the right people. It's very inclusive. You have a lot of people involved. Oh my goodness, lots of people involved, which is great. A lot of people have a voice. Everyone has a voice, which is something that is important if you want people to take ownership of a process. And I think that's kind of what you've done. When I look at some of the advisory groups, you got the people you want there beyond Manitoba, which is really clearly important. And so that's, and because you have the protein industry super cluster in Regina, which is super important, doing an amazing job. I see some integration, not some inclusion, which is what you want at this point. Like I said, I mean, you need to work together. You need to unify together for what I would call traditional agriculture, vegetable protein, animal protein, and that's the strategy that I see right now. Because down the road, there's going to be other things happening, which is really the cell-based agriculture phenomena that is really going to be disruptive. Probably not in North America early on, but I would say in many parts of the world, there is some significant interest. The open innovation context, I think, is actually quite profitable. It's helping people to share knowledge, share information. Not too much, obviously, because you have private companies involved, but it's an open innovation concept, which is great. Like PIC in Regina, same thing. I think there's a lot of sharing going on, which is quite profitable. The one thing that that has come up last week, that did come up last week, is that I know that you guys are at a point where you want to allow industry to take control of the strategy, and frankly, I you need to be careful with that, because companies aren't necessarily governments are good at enabling conditions for growth to allow industry to prosper, and frankly already you're seeing it. Jobs weren't created by the government, investments weren't by government, it was by the private sector. I can't see the strategy remaining successful without the involvement of government. I suspect government will continue to be there involved, but I actually must say that right now things are looking very good, and the industry will I think will need to continue to rely on government to provide some leadership. But obviously the industry will do the work. Will take care of the economy, but you also need a government to enable conditions that will lead the industry to more success, I think. I do think that there's needs to be a more of a focus on food service. Now, the food service industry is down, as I explained earlier, but I think it's important to actually recognize that it's going to grow again, and continuing that relation, that connection. And I can't, maybe I missed it, but I didn't see it in in the strategy clearly. The other thing that that I think the strategy should be thinking about is this whole notion of paradigm shift, demand chain management. Okay, we've often talked about supply chain management. We grow, we process, we distribute, we retail, and that's it. That's the old way of thinking. Right now, you're seeing companies like Rocket, for example, Merit Foods. They're actually thinking about the consumer, very much the future of the consumer. That's demand chain management. Be clear on that paradigm shift. This is all about understanding the consumer and building an infrastructure based on what the consumer actually wants this year, next year, and 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, and so on and so forth. Be prepared. That's the paradigm shift that is going on right now, and it needs to be accentuated, I think. And the last thing I want to say, and I actually did say that a few years ago to the group when the strategy was launched, is that, I mean, you have a great story. There's no doubt in my mind you have a super wonderful story, but I'm afraid it's not known. It's not very known. It's not known by the community beyond Manitoba. I haven't heard about the protein strategy, the Manitoba protein strategy outside of Manitoba. You need case studies. You need communicators. You need a communication strategy as much as possible to get that story out as much, because it deserves it. I mean, I think your successes deserve more attention. So on that note, I'll stop now, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will allow Dixon to come back and chat.
Well, thanks very much, Sylvain. That was, I took down a ton of notes here.
And by the way, I apologize for the couple of typos. As I was presenting, I just realized that I had some typos, so apologies for that.
No problem. I think everybody appreciates that that this whole presentation is pre-recorded. And also, I think one thing that's kind of unique about this, even though we're pre-recording, we still want the audience, when this is presented, to ask their questions on the chat session, because Sylvain will be around virtually to help answer those questions, or those answers we will get some feedback on. So anyways, it's hopefully it all works out, but that's what our strategy is. Sylvain, one of the things that you brought up today, and I thought was a real interesting a comment, is that as as we were growing up as children, and our grandparents, and had gone through the Depression, and they were they never wasted anything. There wasn't a plastic bag that wasn't washed and reused or whatever. Everything, there was a real conscious effort that, hey, you know what, you never know what's going to happen, and you've got to they were trained through that era that you're not sure what's coming down the road, so you always got to play it safe.
Yep.
Your comments today, with children coming through this whole session, where with remote learning, not being able to participate, and eating more meals at home than they've ever eaten before. What do you think those type of changes are going to have on coming down for that generation? What type of influences that's going to have on on our food consumption in the future?
It's a super great question. I wasn't sure if I should have spent more time on this. I think it's an important one. We need to underscore the fact that there is going to be a COVID generation. But when I say COVID generation, often we actually make a reference to age. Actually, the COVID generation is not age-based. I think the COVID generation you'll find people of all ages really part of the COVID generation, but a lot of them will be children, I think, and I think there's going to be a better appreciation for resources. There's going to be a better appreciation for connecting and what food means. And of course, the other reason is inflation. I actually think that right now we're on the verge of seeing a significant shift when it comes to prioritizing food in our lives. You see, Dixon, the average family before the pandemic, the average family was spending, I don't know, about 9.5% of its budget on food, just about. We actually do see that increasing to up to 12, probably within the next few years, which means that people will have to compromise instead of, say, going on a trip or buying a new TV, or all the things that are becoming more expensive all of a sudden. And the work from home will mean that people may spend less on clothing. They may spend less on haircuts. They may spend less on, obviously, transportation. So there is this shift of priority, of life priorities happening right now. That's the COVID generation. And so that's the one piece of the COVID generation. The other piece is risk. We've been talking about public health for 2 years nonstop. We see the virus everywhere. We see viruses everywhere. As soon as you see someone sneeze right next to you, you go, "Oh my God." That's risk perception, and the way we see risk will impact how we feed ourselves. Every now and then, Dixon, you know this, with animal protein, there's always a recall. Food safety is an issue. Something happens all the time. People will be paying attention to these things for their own health. And when it comes to vegetable proteins, when's the last time you saw lentils being recalled? Like, seriously. So the risks are different, and I think it's going to drive how people will make decisions when it comes to food, I think.
Okay. In the first summit, you mentioned that meat producers should not feel threatened by the growing appetite for plant-based proteins, but really distinguish themselves by presenting their products differently as part of a much larger portfolio of protein choices. with what's all gone on, has your perspective changed since 2 years ago?
No, I'm glad you were paying attention. I remember saying that, and I still believe it. You see, uh, for many years, I think we were stuck in this stomach share paradigm. You know, for people in the food industry, food was a zero sum game. If you got into someone's stomach, I won and the other guy lost. That's kind of how we thought. It doesn't work that way anymore. It's about value. It's about the value proposition. And going back to what I said a few years ago to the group, that's exactly what I meant. Food is no longer a zero sum game. It's about providing value and the quality of life. And you need both. I mean, you need animal proteins, you need vegetable proteins. And so that to me is the winning combination. And the strategy that you guys have will allows that to happen, I think. And I'm so glad to see everyone in the same room, well, virtually in the same room to talk to each other. That's important. You don't see that in some parts of the country, by the way.
Yeah. When you take a look at, one of the things that we really see from the Manitoba perspective, and we run into with our suppliers when we're supplying, animals or even on the grain side. It doesn't matter what we are providing from primary production, but this whole verification process, and being able to produce a low carbon, have a low carbon footprint, um, and where we're situated. Um, is there other comparisons in the world that would have as competitive advantage or a better competitive advantage as what we have in Manitoba, for being able to be, to provide a low carbon brand to Manitoba products?
Well, I mean, Manitoba is successful because of what it can offer: clean water, clean energy, space, cheap space, good people, highly qualified employees. I mean, you got a lot going for you, and but with only 1 million people, it's hard to compete against Indiana. You know, and I don't want to criticize Maple Leaf because I know that our dear friend Michael McKim will be speaking at the summit, but I must, and you can't blame Maple Leaf for going to Indiana, but I think that really, if you look at what you guys have now, I don't know if Maple Leaf would have made the same decision, given what we know about Manitoba, how you've been able to, get together, move things along, and become as successful as you guys have been. So I think really it's just this recognition that the strategy really allowed a lot of people from outside to recognize that something's going on and we can do something, we can build something really interesting in Manitoba. That's all. That's the disadvantage that Manitoba would have against other larger states in the US.
Right. And I think one thing that you also brought up in today's discussion, and it's one that uh, we're seeing a lot more exposure to, and we're seeing a lot more investment in, which is those other, the cellular, the fermentation
Yeah,
processes, and that, um, you know, you know, having those skill sets, and a lot of the funding and projects, we always think that a lot of them come out of the Silicon Valley. It's where, because really, you highlighted today that the investment that's going into these industries primarily is non-ag capital. It's outsiders coming in and
absolutely.
and really becoming sort of the nouveau ag producers in a roundabout a way.
Yeah.
And so from a Manitoba perspective, and from a country perspective, how can we how can we attract that type of capital? how do we attract that type of environment also within our strategy to be sustainable protein production? How do we, what would be some recommendations from yourself on how we can become connected to that group, how we can be, how we can facilitate some of that innovation in Manitoba?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it is cell-based agriculture is not something I brought up a few years ago because it wasn't really on the radar. And frankly, we did talk about lab-grown meat a few years ago, and we survey people. I think about at the time only 5%. Like right now, we actually surveyed Canadians about a month ago. 25% of Canadians actually would be willing to try a lab-grown product, like a lab-grown protein. It's not much, but it was actually about 10% just a few years ago. So you can see that really more and more people are curious. Canada right now is not a huge player when it comes to cell base. It's not. I'm actually mentoring one company out of CDL in Calgary right now, which is an American company. And so they're actually coming to Canada to get some mentorship, to get some support. But I think Canada, out of the 200 projects that we're seeing around the world, I think 4 of them are in Canada right now. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, so we're not a big player. If the suggestion the reason why I'm raising this point today is that you are part of a protein strategy and you are inclusive. And I wanted to make a point that inclusive today doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as being inclusive in 10 years from now. I think the pie will be much, much broader when it comes to technologies.
Yeah, full agreement, full agreement. And you know, and I think that one of the areas is there's always seems to be a lot of conflict between you know uh, meat, meat and plant-based. I think there's a lot of synergistic relationships
Oh,
between them all.
absolutely.
Like and whether if we take a look at with the transformation, there's tremendous amount of byproduct utilization that can happen. There's tremendous opportunities on having ingredients, plant-based ingredients, in along with meat and sausages, and that's not a foreign concept. That's been going on for 100 years or longer,
Yeah.
and so I think there's some real synergistics between the industries, and I think that's and I think going forward, I think to be successful in having a diverse industry, we really have to take a look at working together, collaboration, and I think
Well, that's what you're doing, Dixon.
yeah.
I mean, I'd say that before the second protein revolution with plant-based,
Mhm.
I think we all took proteins for granted.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. We went to the meat counter, you know, the meat trifecta. Tonight it's going to be pork because it's on sale. Tomorrow it's going to be chicken. After that it's beef, and that was it. Now it's exciting again.
Yeah.
And so for everyone, not just for vegetable proteins, but for animal proteins as well. And that's what I meant a few years ago, valuing your product on the basis of choice and
Right.
alternatives that consumers have. Everyone wins.
Yeah. So when you talked about today, and your numbers are right on with our internal numbers as far as our exposure to the retail and service side, where historically it was 65-35. We got as high as 91 to 9%, and
Yeah.
and today, you know, I was going to say 67-33, and you're 72-28. I don't think we're too far off.
Yeah.
Where do you think it's going to land? Now with this new with the population from that's gone through COVID, is our landing and particularly combination of COVID, combination of inflation. we have multifaceted things happening at the same time here.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
are we going to be at a, are we going to be at 70-30, or are we going back, like what is going to be that part?
I'm pre I'm I think I'm a little bit more conservative than you are, Dixon, to be honest. I don't think there's going to be. It's unfortunate for our food service friends because just before COVID hit, they were looking at $100 billion of sales in 1 year in 2020. They were for the first time in history. So that sector was just booming. Everyone was going out, spending a lot of money. But with COVID now, things really slowed down. There are fewer players. We've lost about 15 to 17,000 full service restaurants in this country. Like 17,000. That's a lot of businesses. And so the offering is smaller, but if you talk to Cisco, if you talk to Gordon Foods, I mean, their costs have gone way up. And so you're looking at menu prices going up by as much as 10%. Not everyone will be able to afford to go out as much as before. That's really what I think is going to, people will still continue to go out, don't get me wrong, but not as often, which is probably going to keep people at bay. And people are cooking more. They did cook. Now they trained themselves to stay home a little bit more. And so the sector is going to be up against a more food literate market. And it's going to be tougher. And the other thing that I haven't talked about, Dixon, is the sector's ability to deliver at people's homes.
Yeah.
Like seriously, you guys are the home of Skip the Dishes. I mean, seriously, 29% of households in Canada will use a food delivery app at least once every 2 weeks. And online delivery for groceries, 17%. 17% of households in Canada will order online food retail at least once every 2 weeks. Right now, 2 years after the pandemic started.
Yeah.
That's a lot of business.
Sylvain, I wish we could go on for another hour. This has just been wonderful, and we really appreciate your presentation, the thoughts that you brought forward to us, and some of the recommendations that you have for our strategy, and we just want to really say just thank you, Sylvain, for everything you've done here today.
My pleasure, Dixon. And again, congratulations on all your success in Manitoba and beyond.
Yeah, and that. So thanks everybody for attending, and remember that chat box is for your use, and we look forward to seeing everybody and having a great turnout for this wonderful presentation. Thanks very much.